The house smelled of turkey and sage when I walked into the dining room that Thanksgiving in Mount Fairview. My mother had already lined the china plates along the table, and the football game murmured from the living room. Warren sat in his recliner, a half-empty bottle of Budweiser at his feet, cheeks flushed from the first three. Set the table. "Mari," my mother said, not even looking up from her casserole. I carried the silverware without protest, but when Warren barked for me to fetch another bottle of wine from the pantry, I froze. I was 29 years old, not a child under orders. "I'll finish these first," I told him. That was all it took. The fork was in his hand before I registered the movement, sharp prongs digging into the soft skin of my arm. It wasn't a deep wound, but it stung hot, sudden. I stepped back. Breath caught in my throat. "Warren," my mother hissed, her voice more scolding than alarmed. "For heaven's sake, not at the table." She reached for a napkin, pressed it lightly against the spot, and muttered, "It was an accident. Don't make this into something it isn't. Family first. Marielle, remember that." Her words settled heavier than the blood that spotted the linen. I excused myself, walked down the hallway to the bathroom, and locked the door. The sting was nothing new. What mattered was the photograph I snapped on my phone, the tiny dots of blood, the red welt, the timestamp. Another entry for the folder hidden behind layers of passwords and cloud storage. When I returned, the turkey had been carved and laughter had resumed, as if nothing had happened. I sat quietly, fork in hand, and swallowed my silence along with the stuffing, already thinking of the evidence I'd add to my growing archive. After dinner, while the house settled into its familiar haze of pie and muted conversation, I thought of the folder waiting on my laptop back in Charlotte. It wasn't just the photographs of bruises and welts. It was the years of numbers, columns, and careful notes that told the real story. I started the spreadsheet when I was 18, the summer before college. My mother had called me in tears about the leaking roof, saying she and Warren couldn't cover it without my help. I dipped into my savings, telling myself it was temporary. That one loan turned into dozens. Medical bills for Warren's back surgery, repairs for Jacob's first car, tuition payments when Jacob couldn't get enough aid. Each transaction neatly logged with dates, amounts, and notes. Over time, the totals grew sickening. Each line another reminder that I was more bank than daughter. Now, at 29, I work as an internal auditor for a firm in Charlotte. My colleagues joke about how obsessive I am with receipts and reconciliations, but they don't know that habit was born from survival, not ambition. Numbers became my shield, order against the chaos my parents created. I remember the night it all began, the night my father collapsed in the kitchen when I was 8. Aneurysm, they said. He was gone before the ambulance made it to the house. My world cracked in half, and before the pieces had settled, Diane remarried Warren. He was a Marine, a man of rules, and at first I mistook his discipline for stability. It didn't take long to learn that rules in his hands became chains. I closed my eyes at the table, my mother's laughter floating in from the living room. The sting on my arm pulsed, reminding me I had just logged another entry in a long account that had begun the day I lost my father. I was still a child when the first cracks appeared, though I didn't understand them at the time. After my father's funeral, I overheard neighbors whispering in the kitchen about how at least Robert had that policy for Diane and the girl. I didn't know what a life insurance policy was, only that people spoke of it as a kind of safety net. Weeks later, when I asked my mother if Daddy had left something for us, she pressed her lips together and said, "There was nothing. Everything went to funeral costs." Her tone left no space for questions. As the years passed, more oddities surfaced. Our mortgage, which my father had nearly paid off, was suddenly reissued under Warren's name. The college savings account I'd heard my father talk about vanished. By the time I was ready for college, my mother said there simply wasn't money, and that was why I needed to work double shifts at the diner. She framed it as a lesson in independence, but deep down I felt something had been stolen long before I stepped into my first class. Warren wrapped himself in his Marine service, shaking hands at church, telling stories about discipline and sacrifice. People nodded respectfully, eager to see him as a pillar of strength. But I caught the other stories, the ones whispered about bar fights near the VFW hall, DUIs that somehow disappeared before they landed on a record, each rumor stacked against the image he worked so hard to polish. For years, I told myself it was mismanagement, bad luck, poor choices. That was easier than believing my mother and Warren had conspired to strip away what my father had left behind. But the older I got, the more the numbers refused to add up. What I once chalked up to loss began to look like theft, calculated and deliberate. I didn't say it aloud, not even to myself, but the suspicion took root and grew stronger with every missing dollar and every dismissive answer. And on that Thanksgiving night, when I pressed ice to my arm and scrolled through my hidden files, I knew the truth was no longer something I could ignore. The phone rang the Saturday after Thanksgiving, just as I was finishing a grocery run in Charlotte. I almost didn't answer when I saw the name flash across the screen. Lorraine, my father's mother. We spoke only a few times a year, holidays, birthdays, but the sound of her voice carried a steadiness that pulled me back to a time before everything fractured. "Marielle," she said, without preamble, "I think it's time we talked." Her voice was firm, not casual. She asked me to come to her house in Mount Fairview the next afternoon. "There are things you need to see. Things I should have shown you years ago." The drive took 40 minutes, the road winding past bare trees and shuttered gas stations. Her house stood where it always had, white siding dulled by decades, the porch light still shining even in daylight. She hugged me tightly, then led me straight to the dining table where neat stacks of folders were spread out, arranged with the care of someone who had been waiting a long time. "These," she said, sliding the top folder toward me, "are your father's accounts." Inside were bank statements, policy documents, and a copy of the mortgage from the year he died. I scanned the pages, my pulse quickening. The balances were higher than anything my mother had ever admitted. There was a trust set up for your education. Lorraine continued. "Robert wanted you to have choices. But within months of his death, withdrawals started. Some were small, others larger, always justified with vague notations, household, medical, emergency." And then Warren's name began appearing on things it shouldn't have. I looked up, my throat tight. Mom told me everything went to the funeral. Lorraine shook her head, her eyes wet but steady. I suspected for years they were siphoning it off, but I didn't have proof until I requested these records. I kept them, waiting for the day you were ready to see. The weight of the pages pressed against my chest. Every suspicion I had carried in silence was here, in black ink and cold numbers. Lorraine rested her hand on mine, and for the first time I understood she hadn't just been keeping memories alive, she had been keeping evidence. Lorraine slid another folder across the table, heavier than the rest. The cover sheet read, "Mitchell Kincaid Education Trust." My father's name was listed as the settlor, my own as the beneficiary. I traced the letters with my fingertip, almost afraid the paper would vanish if I blinked too long. We sat shoulder to shoulder as I turned the pages. The trust had been established the year before my father died, funded by his life insurance and part of his retirement savings. Each annual statement was there, the numbers growing over time, interest compounding quietly in the background. By the most recent entry, the balance stood at $217,000. I felt my stomach twist. That money could have paid for college, for graduate school, for the years of double shifts and loans I had endured. My chest burned as I flipped faster until one page made me stop cold. A withdrawal notice, $22,000, dated the year Warren had his back surgery. The note read medical expense. The signature at the bottom was my own, except it wasn't. I studied the scrawl my name, but written in blocky, uneven strokes, like someone trying too hard to copy it. Lorraine leaned closer. I had it compared. It's forgery, and the timing lines up exactly with his hospital stay. My throat closed. It wasn't just theft. It was identity stolen. My name used to funnel money out of the only legacy my father had left me. Lorraine didn't soften her voice. This isn't a family squabble anymore, Marie. It's fraud. It's breach of fiduciary duty. It's criminal. She pulled a business card from her pocket and placed it in front of me. Harvey Morrison, estate attorney. I've known him since Robert was alive. She explained, he can help, but you need to decide if you're ready to act. I stared at the card, the bold print steady against the blur of my vision. For years I had carried the weight of suspicion, convinced I was imagining shadows. Now the proof lay in front of me. Undeniable. Lorraine rested her hand on mine again. Your father set this up to protect you. Don't let them erase his intention. The words settled deep. I closed the folder slowly, feeling the paper press into my palms like a verdict. The decision, at last, was mine to make. Harvey's office smelled faintly of old books and coffee, the kind of place where truth seemed to cling to the walls. Lorraine and I sat across from him as he introduced Dolores, a forensic accountant with sharp eyes and an even sharper pencil. She spread the files across the table like a surgeon laying out instruments. It didn't take long for the numbers to tell their story. Over 21 years, nearly $500,000 had slipped through my mother's and Warren's hands. The trust was only one piece. There were withdrawals from my father's 401k, checks against life insurance, and even smaller accounts closed without explanation. Dolores circled each with her pen, marking totals until the page looked like a crime scene. Then she slid over a set of tax filings. My name appeared in neat type, followed by a signature I didn't recognize as mine. These were submitted in your early 20s, she said, tapping the lines, claiming you had no dependents, no tuition expenses. Conveniently, that let them keep more money under their roof. My stomach turned. I'd thought the forgery on the trust was the worst of it. Seeing my identity used again, on documents filed with the government, made my skin crawl. Harvey leaned back, steepling his fingers. This isn't just mismanagement. It's fraud, forgery, breach of fiduciary duty. A criminal case could be made, if you're willing. Lorraine reached for my hand, steady as always. I've been waiting until you were strong enough to see this. I couldn't force it on you, Mari. You had to come here on your own. Her faith cut both ways, comfort and weight. Shame pressed in, reminding me of the years I'd stayed silent, convincing myself it was easier to endure than confront. Fury followed close behind, aimed squarely at my mother. She hadn't just looked away. She had signed, concealed, enabled. I exhaled slowly, tracing the inked circles on the page. $500,000, stolen in plain sight. The truth was here, undeniable. And for the first time, I felt the shift from victim to witness, ready to take the stand. Lorraine insisted on cooking the roast herself. The smell of garlic and rosemary filled her kitchen as I set out extra chairs. It looked like any other Sunday dinner, but the stack of folders on the buffet told the truth. This was no gathering for reconciliation. It was an ambush of evidence. Warren arrived first, swaggering in with Jacob behind him, their voices loud with forced cheer. Diane followed, her eyes darting between me and Lorraine, wary as a stray dog sensing a trap. She froze when she saw Harvey and Dolores already seated, their briefcases at their feet. Beside them were two of Lorraine's church friends, women known for keeping nothing to themselves, witnesses. We ate in uneasy silence until Lorraine stood, sliding the first photograph onto the table. My arm, punctured and red from Thanksgiving. Gasps rippled across the room. I kept my eyes fixed on my plate, the memory still raw. "What is this?" Warren barked. "It's the truth," Lorraine said calmly. She laid down more spreadsheets, tax documents, forged signatures. Dolores explained each line with the precision of a surgeon. Harvey added the legal weight, describing fraud, forgery, breach of trust. Diane broke first. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "We were surviving. You don't understand how hard it was." Lorraine's voice cut through her sobs. Surviving doesn't mean stealing your daughter's future. Warren tried to shout over her, red-faced, fists clenched, but Harvey slid another document across the table, the forged withdrawal matching Warren's back surgery. His bluster collapsed into silence. The churchwomen nodded gravely. "This isn't family squabbling," one said. "This is criminal. Finally." Lorraine leaned forward, her eyes steady. "Here is your choice. You sign restitution, surrender the trust, and accept guilty pleas, or you face trial. The evidence is ready either way." The room was silent except for the ticking clock. Diane's tears fell onto her napkin. Warren's hands trembled as he reached for the pen. Jacob sat frozen, his jaw tight, watching his family unravel one signature at a time. I didn't touch my food again. The dinner was no longer about nourishment. It was about the reckoning that had finally been served. The pen scratched against the paper as Warren scrawled his name. His jaw clenched so tight the veins in his neck pulsed. Diane signed next, her hands shaking, mascara streaking down her face. Jacob muttered protests under his breath, insisting it wasn't fair, that we were humiliating them in front of outsiders. But no one listened. The documents spoke louder than any of us. When the last signature was done, Lorraine gathered the folders with the precision of a banker closing out a ledger. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. I could hear Warren's labored breathing, Diane's muffled sobs, Jacob's restless shifting in his chair. My own heartbeat steadied for the first time in years. Within weeks, the fallout began. The mortgage company posted notice of foreclosure on the family home. The lake cabin, once their pride, was listed for sale to cover debts. Warren's past came back to haunt him as investigators reopened records from his first marriage, piecing together the pattern that stretched far beyond me. I kept my distance, letting Harvey handle the logistics. But one evening, as I left Lorraine's porch, Jacob was waiting at the end of the walk. His eyes burned with anger I'd known since childhood. "You destroyed us," he spat. "You had to drag everyone down just because you couldn't let things go." I met his glare without flinching. "I didn't destroy anything, Jacob. Family destroyed itself. I just stopped paying the bill." He flinched at the words but said nothing more. I walked past him, keys tight in my hand, and didn't look back. By the time I reached Charlotte that night, the horizon felt wider than it ever had. The wreckage was theirs to carry. What I held instead was the weight of possibility, the quiet sense that something new might finally take root. Back in Charlotte, I began with the simplest act of defiance, opening new accounts in my own name, beyond the reach of anyone else. The restitution money from the trust transferred in clean lines of digits, steady and untouchable. I moved my savings, closed old accounts, and let Harvey's office handle the paperwork that made the separation final. For the first time in my adult life, my money was mine. At night, I researched MBA programs, something I had once dismissed as impossible. Wharton, Duke, even UNC Chapel Hill applications spread across my desk like a new kind of map. Each one asked for essays about resilience, leadership, vision. I had more than enough material for all three. Meanwhile, the news from Mount Fairview trickled in. Warren drank harder, his body finally collapsing under years of rage and liquor. Liver failure, the doctors said. Diane withdrew into herself, no longer the sharp-tongued woman who had once managed every excuse. Her depression kept her homebound, curtains drawn against the neighbors' stairs. Jacob called often at first, his voicemails a barrage of fury. He accused me of betrayal, of tearing the family apart, of choosing money over blood. I let each message play out without reply, the venom losing force with every repetition. Eventually his calls slowed, but the bitterness never softened. In my apartment, I framed the letter my father had written when I was 7, words that had lived in a shoebox for years. Be smart. Don't let them dim your light. I hung it above my desk, a reminder that his voice still reached me, even after decades of silence. Relief spread slowly, a steady hum beneath my days. but emptiness sat beside it. The kind that comes when winning means losing the people who were supposed to love you most. And yet, even in that hollow space, something stronger began to rise. Christmas came quietly that year, without the noise of obligation or the weight of dread. I set my small table in Charlotte with a simple red runner, plates that didn't match, and the smell of pot roast filling the apartment. Lorraine arrived first, carrying her famous apple pie, her smile lighting the room before she even set down her coat. Harvey followed with his wife and daughter, laughter trailing behind them like carolers at the door. We ate until the plates were bare, passing food without tension, pouring wine without command. Conversation flowed in easy waves, stories of school, church, work. No one raised their voice, no one cut anyone down. The only sharpness came from the clink of forks against plates and the laughter that followed a shared memory. At one point, Lorraine reached across the table, her hand warm on mine. "Family isn't who shares your blood," she said, her eyes steady on mine. "It's who shows up with proof when you're ready to fight back." The words landed like a benediction. For so long, I had measured my worth by what was taken from me: time, money, trust. Now, in the glow of the Christmas lights strung around my window, I felt something returned. Not just the money reclaimed or the justice secured, but the quiet certainty that I was no longer bound to roles others had forced on me. I wasn't an ATM, a scapegoat, or a victim. I was simply Marielle auditor, student, granddaughter, host, whole in a way I had never believed possible. As we cut into Lorraine's pie, the sweetness filling the room, I let myself breathe into the moment, knowing that freedom had finally found a seat at my table.